The night is heavy, and the neon lights of the city only serve to cast longer, darker shadows. Welcome back to True Crime Chronicles. I am your narrator, your guide through the labyrinth of human malice. Tonight, we do not just step into a crime scene. We step into a continent of silence, secrets, and brutality. We are opening the files on Asian nightmares. We will traverse from the high-altitude void of a missing jet to the claustrophobic horror of a concrete drum in Japan. But we begin with the mystery that turned the entire world into a detective, a case where the weapon was not a gun or a knife, but the sky itself. It is March 8th, 2014. The air in Kuala Lumpur is thick, clinging to your skin like a bad memory. At the international airport, the atmosphere is routine, filled with the mundane hum of rolling suitcases and tired travelers checking their watches. Flight MH370 is sitting on the tarmac, a metal leviathan preparing to leap into the dark. On board, there are 227 passengers and 12 crew members. They are fathers, mothers, artists, and engineers. They are strapping themselves in, unaware that they are about to become the ghosts of the 21st century. The captain is Zahari Ahmad Shah, a veteran with thousands of hours under his belt. Beside him is Farik Abdul Hamid, a young first officer approaching his final training flight. The engines roar to life, a deafening scream that drowns out any hesitation. At 12:41 in the morning, the Boeing 777 lifts off the ground, climbing into the obsidian blackness above the South China Sea. For the first 40 minutes, everything is perfect. It is the kind of boring precision that aviation relies on, but chaos is patient. It waits for the moment you look away. At 1:19 in the morning, the plane approaches the limit of Malaysian airspace. Air traffic control radios in for the final handover to Vietnamese airspace. The voice from the cockpit is calm, steady, and utterly unremarkable. "Good night, Malaysian 370. Those are the last words ever heard from the flight. They hang in the recording tapes like a tombstone engraving. Good night, a farewell that became a prophecy. Seconds later, the transponder, the device that tells the world who you are and where you are, shuts down. The blip on the radar screen blinks once, twice, and then vanishes. Confusion is a slow-spreading poison. In the control towers of Vietnam and Malaysia, there is a delay in panic. Perhaps it is a glitch, perhaps a faulty wire. But as the minutes drag into an hour, the silence from the radio grows deafening. The plane has not crashed. There is no distress signal, no mayday, no explosion detected by satellites. It has simply ceased to exist in the digital world. But in the physical world, something far more sinister is happening. The plane does not go down. It turns. Military radar, the silent watcher that ignores transponders, picks up a faint, unidentified signal. The aircraft performs a sharp turn to the west, deviating from its path to Beijing. It flies back over the Malaysian peninsula, crossing land it just departed, like a phantom returning to haunt the living. It flies comfortably, navigating waypoints with the precision of a human hand guiding the yoke. This is not a mechanical failure. This is not a fire on board that incapacitates the crew. This is a choice. Someone in that cockpit, or someone who took that cockpit, is guiding 239 people into the unknown. The sun rises over Beijing, but the arrivals board shows red text that chills the blood. Delayed. Then cancelled. Families are gathered at the airport, clutching bouquets of flowers and signs with names written in hopeful calligraphy. The panic begins as a murmur, and swells into a scream. Where are they? The airline officials have no answers. The governments have no answers. The ocean is vast, covering nearly 70% of our planet, and somewhere in that blue abyss, a 300-ton machine is hiding. The search begins, and it is the largest and most expensive manhunt in human history. Ships plow through the waves of the South China Sea. Planes scour the surface looking for debris, for a seat cushion, for a life jacket. Anything. But the ocean offers nothing but reflection. Then, the data reveals a shocking truth. Satellite pings, automatic handshakes between the engines and a station in space, indicate the plane stayed in the air for hours after it vanished from radar. It flew south, straight toward the freezing, desolate darkness of the southern Indian Ocean. Why? That is the question that tears at the soul. Why fly 6 hours into the middle of nowhere? This was not a hijacking for ransom. No demands were ever made. This was not a terrorist attack claimed by any group. It feels like a suicide pact forced upon innocent strangers. The theory of the pilot acting alone arises, painting a portrait of a man clinically depressed or politically motivated, using his skills to disappear from the world and taking everyone with him. But without the black box, without the voice recorder, it is all just smoke and mirrors. Weeks turn into months. The world watches as the search zone shifts to a remote stretch of water west of Australia. The waves there are the size of buildings. The depth is measured in miles. It is a place where sunlight never touches the bottom. The narrative shifts from a rescue mission to a recovery mission, and finally to a funeral without bodies. The families are left in a purgatory of grief. They cannot bury their dead because there is no proof of death. There is only the flight path ending in a straight line into oblivion. Then, a piece of the puzzle washes up on a shore thousands of miles away. A flaperon, a part of the wing, is found on Reunion Island. It is ragged, torn by the violence of impact, and coated in barnacles. It is the first tangible proof that the metal bird hit the water. But it does not tell us how or why. It sits on the sand like a bleached bone, whispering secrets it cannot speak. The discovery confirms the crash, but it deepens the mystery. The currents carried it there, but the main wreckage, the fuselage, the cockpit, remains in the deep, guarding the final moments of those souls. We are left with a ghost story for the modern age, a technological marvel that vanished in an era of constant surveillance. It reminds us that no matter how advanced we become, the world is still big enough to swallow us whole. The disappearance of Flight MH370 is not just a tragedy, it is a psychological terror. It taps into the fear of being lost, of screaming into a radio that no one answers. But as we stare into this abyss, another nightmare begins to stir. This time, the horror is not in the vastness of the ocean, but in the cramped confines of a water tank atop a hotel in Los Angeles, where a young traveler from Hong Kong meets a fate that defies logic. Los Angeles is a city of dualities. On one side, you have the blinding glamour of Hollywood, where dreams are manufactured like automobiles. On the other side, just a few miles away, lies Skid Row, a concrete purgatory of lost souls and broken glass. Standing as a silent sentinel over this decay is the Cecil Hotel. Built in the 1920s, it was meant to be a destination for business travelers, but it became a magnet for death. Serial killers like Richard Ramirez rested their heads there after nights of carnage. It is a place where the walls seem to absorb the darkness of its guests. In January of 2013, 21-year-old Elisa checked into the Cecil. She was a Canadian student on a solo tour of the West Coast, looking for adventure and a break from her studies. Her blog posts from the trip were bright and optimistic, filled with photos of zoos and speakeasies. She was the picture of youthful innocence, a stark contrast to the grim reputation of the hotel she chose for its budget prices. But innocence is no shield in a place that has seen so much blood. On January 31st, Elisa was scheduled to check out and travel to Santa Cruz. She never made it to the lobby. Her parents, frantic when their daily calls went unanswered, contacted the Los Angeles Police Department. The search began, but the Cecil is a labyrinth of 600 rooms. Police knocked on doors, scoured the hallways, and brought in dogs, but the scent had gone cold. It was as if she had evaporated. For 2 weeks, her face was plastered on flyers across the city. Just another missing girl in a metropolis that swallows people whole. Then, the police released a videotape that would captivate and terrify the entire internet. The footage comes from the elevator surveillance camera. It is grainy, flickering, and utterly disturbing. Elisa enters the elevator pressing multiple buttons, but the doors do not close. She steps back, peering out into the hallway with a strange mixture of playfulness and caution. She moves in and out of the car, her movements erratic, almost dance-like. At one point, she cowers in the corner as if hiding from someone. Then, she steps out into the hall and begins gesturing with her hands. She is speaking to someone or something that the camera cannot see. Her hands twist and turn in bizarre shapes, like she is swimming through the air or casting a spell. Is she hallucinating? Is she being threatened by an unseen assailant standing just out of the frame? Or is she playing a game that only she understands? After minutes of this surreal performance, she walks away to the left, disappearing down the corridor. The elevator doors, finally obeying some delayed command, slide shut. That was the last time anyone saw Elisa Lam alive. The video went viral, spawning thousands of theories, from psychotic breaks to paranormal possession. While the internet analyzed every frame of that video, the guests at the Cecil Hotel began to notice something wrong with the building's life support. The water pressure on the upper floors dropped significantly. Then came the complaints about the quality. Guests reported that the water coming out of their taps had a brownish-black tint. It had a strange, sweet odor and a terrible, metallic taste. Some said it looked like sewage. For days, people brushed their teeth, showered, and drank this tainted liquid, unaware of the horror causing the contamination. On the morning of February 19th, a maintenance worker was sent to the roof to investigate the water tanks. The roof of the Cecil is not easily accessible. The doors are alarmed, and the fire escapes are steep. Yet, the worker found the hatch of one of the 4 massive 4,000-gallon cisterns open. Peering inside with his flashlight, he saw something floating in the darkness. It was Elisa. She was drifting face up, her body decomposing in the very water supply that the hotel guests had been using for over 2 weeks. The discovery turned the stomach of the entire city. The fire department had to cut open the side of the tank to retrieve her, as the opening was too small for their equipment. When they pulled her out, a new set of mysteries emerged. Elisa was naked. Her clothes, the same ones she wore in the elevator video, were floating in the water beside her, coated in a sand-like sediment. Why would she undress in a freezing cold water tank? And more importantly, how did she get in? The lid of the tank was heavy, metal, and difficult to move. To get inside, she would have had to climb a ladder, lift the lid, jump in, and then, the most impossible part, close the heavy lid back over herself, while treading water in the dark. The coroner ruled the death as accidental drowning, citing her bipolar disorder as a significant factor. The theory was that she had a manic episode, believed she was being chased, and hid in the tank. But for those who watched the elevator video, the explanation felt insufficient. It felt like a rational sticker slapped onto an irrational nightmare. The coincidences surrounding the case only added to the unease. A tuberculosis outbreak in Skid Row around the same time was being tested with a kit named LAMELISA. The plot of the horror movie Dark Water eerily mirrored the events, featuring a girl drowning in a hotel water tank. Whether it was a tragic mental health crisis or something more sinister, the image of Elisa in that elevator, talking to the empty air, remains a permanent scar on the digital consciousness. It reminds us that madness can be a quiet, solitary room where the doors never close. But while the horror at the Cecil was contained to a single building, our next case proves that terror can be mass-produced and placed on a shelf in your local grocery store. We leave the tainted water of Los Angeles for the windy streets of Chicago, where a different kind of poisoning sparked a nationwide panic. This was not a slow decay in a hidden tank. This was sudden, random death sealed in a plastic bottle. A headache cure that became a death sentence. The autumn of 1982 in Chicago was crisp and unsuspecting. Suburbia was the picture of the American dream, manicured lawns, unlocked doors, and a sense of invincibility. But on the morning of September 29th, that dream was shattered by a domestic terror so intimate it changed the way the world lived. It began with 12-year-old Mary Kellerman. She woke up with a sore throat, a common ailment for a schoolgirl. Her parents gave her a single extra-strength Tylenol capsule to ease the pain. Minutes later, Mary collapsed on the bathroom floor. She was pronounced dead before noon. Miles away, in the suburb of Arlington Heights, 27-year-old Adam Janus was suffering from chest pains. Thinking it was a minor ache, he reached for a bottle of Tylenol he had purchased earlier that day. He took 2 capsules. Within the hour, his heart stopped. The tragedy of Adam's sudden death brought his grieving family together at his home. His brother Stanley and Stanley's wife Teresa were devastated. In the midst of their mourning, battling the shock headaches that come with tears, they found the same bottle of Tylenol on the kitchen counter. Seeking relief, they swallowed the capsules. By the end of the day, 3 members of the Janus family were dead. The coincidence was too impossible to ignore. A sharp-witted nurse and 2 firefighters pieced together the common thread: the red and white capsules. The police rushed to the Janus home and retrieved the bottle. Inside, they smelled the faint, bitter scent of almonds. It was the olfactory signature of cyanide. A lethal dose of potassium cyanide, enough to kill thousands, had been packed into the gelatin shells. The medicine cabinet had become a murder weapon. Panic spread through Chicago, like a wildfire fueled by wind. This was not a gunman in an alley. This was death sitting on the shelves of grocery stores and pharmacies. Police cars drove through the streets, blaring warnings over loudspeakers. Do not take Tylenol. Dispose of it immediately. Hospitals were flooded with terrified citizens claiming they had been poisoned. The makers of the drug, Johnson & Johnson, made an unprecedented move. They recalled 31 million bottles, valuing over $100 million, effectively pulling every single unit off the American market. The investigation revealed a chilling modus operandi. The killer had not manufactured the poison pills in a factory. Instead, they had walked into various drugstores, purchased bottles of Tylenol, taken them home, and meticulously replaced the medicine with cyanide. Then, in an act of cold-blooded patience, they returned to the stores and placed the tainted bottles back on the shelves, waiting for random victims to play a game of Russian roulette. It was a crime of opportunity, a perfect crime, because there was no motive, no connection between the killer and the victims. 7 people died in total. The FBI hunted for the Tylenol man, chasing leads that went from disgruntled employees to extortionists. One man, James Lewis, sent a letter demanding $1 million to stop the killings, but he was in New York and could not be placed in Chicago. He went to prison for extortion, but the actual killer was never found. The case went cold, leaving a legacy of fear. Today, every time you peel a plastic seal off a bottle or pop a blister pack, you are performing a ritual born from this tragedy. The tamper-proof seal is the only memorial we have for Mary, Adam, and the others. The Tylenol murders taught America that safety is an illusion. But while Chicago dealt with a phantom who killed from a distance across the Pacific, another nation was about to face a monster who preferred the intimacy of the kill. We leave the sterile aisles of American pharmacies and the concrete grid of Chicago for the muddy, rain-soaked rice paddies of South Korea. It is 1986. The air is humid, smelling of wet earth and impending doom. In the rural village of Hwaseong, women are beginning to disappear, and the only witness is the rain. This is not a random poisoning. This is a hunt. The killer here does not hide behind a product. He hides in the tall grass, waiting for the red glow of a sunset or the red fabric of a dress. He is South Korea's first documented serial killer, a phantom who would elude capture for decades, leaving behind a trail of bodies bound in their own clothing. As we step into the mud of Hwaseong, remember, in the 1980s, DNA profiling was a futuristic dream, and in these fields, a scream can be swallowed by the silence of the night instantly. The rain in Hwaseong does not wash away the sins of the earth. It only presses them deeper into the mud. We are now in South Korea, in the year 1986. The country is on the verge of a transformation, preparing to host the Asian Games and eventually the Olympics. Seoul is a city of neon and construction cranes, a beacon of the future. But 40 miles south, in the rural farming villages of Hwaseong, time moves to the rhythm of the harvest. Here, there are no streetlights, only the moon reflecting off the water in the rice paddies. And in this darkness, a monster is waiting. On September 15th, 71-year-old Lee Won-im visited her daughter and began the walk home. It was a journey she had made 1,000 times. The path cut through the fields, a shortcut that locals used without a second thought. But she never arrived. Days later, her body was found in a pasture. Her legs were bent in an unnatural angle, and her hands were bound behind her back. The police, accustomed to petty theft and drunken brawls, were baffled. They labelled it an accident initially, perhaps a fall, until the bruising on her neck told a different story. She had been strangled. The village was unsettled, but life went on. Death is a part of rural life, usually claiming the old or the sick, but terror truly arrived on October 20th. 25-year-old Park Hyun-suk was walking home from a bus stop in the pouring rain. The canal she walked past was a concrete trench filled with runoff. That is where they found her. Her body was naked, her clothes used to bind her hands. The knotting was complex, tight, and cruel. It was not the work of a frantic robber. It was the work of someone who took pleasure in the process. This was the beginning of the Hwaseong serial murders. Over the next 5 years, 10 women would be found in the fields and hills surrounding the village. They ranged in age from 14 to 71. The killer did not discriminate. He hunted opportunity. He hunted on rainy nights when the sound of the downpour would mask the screams of his victims. The police were overwhelmed. At the time, forensic science in Korea was in its infancy. There was no DNA testing. There were no CCTV cameras. There was only mud and footprints that washed away by morning. A mythology of fear began to construct itself around the killer. Rumors spread that he only targeted women wearing red clothes. It was a whisper that became a rule. Women in the village burned their red skirts and blouses. They stopped leaving their homes after sunset. The police, desperate and under immense pressure from the media, began grasping at straws. They consulted shamans who performed rituals to divine the killer's identity. They erected a scarecrow in the rice fields with a sign that read, "If you kill again, you will die here." It was a plea to a ghost. The investigation became a tragedy in itself. Police officers, exhausted and humiliated by their failure, rounded up suspects based on flimsy evidence. They beat confessions out of innocent men. One man, Yoon Sung-yo, was tortured into admitting to the 8th murder. He spent 20 years in prison for a crime he did not commit, a victim of the system's desperate need to show a face to the public. The real killer watched from the shadows, likely mocking the scarecrows and the shamans. He continued to kill, leaving his signature knots as a taunt. The brutality of the crimes was something the country had never seen. In one case, the killer used a peach slice to gag the victim. In another, he used the victim's own socks to strangle her. He was a sadist who treated human bodies like puzzles to be dismantled. The fear was so palpable that it changed the cultural DNA of South Korea. Parents walked their children to school. Doors that were once left open were now bolted shut. The rice paddies, once a symbol of sustenance, became a landscape of death. For 30 years, the case remained cold. It became the subject of the masterpiece film Memories of Murder, which depicted the futility of the investigation. The statute of limitations expired, meaning that even if the killer were found, he could not be prosecuted. It seemed as though evil had won, but science is patient. In 2019, advances in DNA extraction allowed forensic teams to analyze the old evidence, the underwear and socks preserved in police lockers. They found a match. His name was Lee Chun-jae. He was not a phantom. He was not a demon. He was a man sitting in a prison cell in Busan, already serving a life sentence for the rape and murder of his sister-in-law in 1994. When confronted with the evidence, his facade crumbled. He confessed to all 10 Hwaseong murders and 4 others. He described the killings with a chilling nonchalance, remembering details that only the killer could know. He had been hiding in plain sight, living out his days while the families of his victims rotted in grief. The Hwaseong case serves as a grim reminder of the limitations of justice. The killer was caught, yes, but he can never be punished for these specific crimes due to the laws of the time. He remains a symbol of a lost era of innocence, where a man could walk out of the darkness, take a life, and vanish back into the rain. The terror of Hwaseong has ended, but the scars on the land remain. The wind blowing through the rice grass still sounds like a whisper, a warning. But as we close the file on the rainy fields of Korea, We must prepare ourselves for a different kind of horror. We are moving from the wet, open spaces of the countryside to the suffocating confines of a suburban house in Tokyo. A house where a family was slaughtered on New Year's Eve, and the killer didn't run. He stayed. He ate their food. He surfed their internet. He slept in their beds. We travel now to the Setagaya district, where the new millennium began with a bloodbath that defies all psychological explanation. It is the eve of the 21st century, December 30th, 2000. Tokyo is vibrating with a kinetic energy, a city of 12 million people preparing to welcome a new millennium. The streets of Shibuya are a river of neon and noise, but in the quiet, upscale ward of Setagaya, the Miyazawa family is settling in for a peaceful night. Mikio, an engineer, his wife Yasuko, a teacher, and their 2 young children, 8-year-old Nina and 6-year-old Rei, are safe inside their 2-story home. It is a house that backs onto a park, isolated by a skate park fence, a fortress of suburban bliss. Sometime around 11 at night, a shadow climbs the fence. He scrambles up a tree and enters through a 2nd-story bathroom window. What follows is a storm of violence so sudden and absolute that it defies comprehension. The intruder strangles young Rei in his sleep. When Mikio rushes upstairs to investigate the noise, he is met with a sashimi knife. The struggle is brutal. Mikio fights for his family, but the blade is relentless. The killer then turns his attention to Yasuko and Nina. The details of their end are too graphic to recount, a frenzy of rage that leaves the house painted in red. But the murder is not the most terrifying part of the Setagaya case. It is what happens after. In most home invasions, the killer flees immediately, fueled by adrenaline and the fear of capture. But this man, this phantom, does not run. He stays. He remains in the house with the bodies of the family he has just slaughtered for hours. He treats the crime scene not as a place of horror, but as his own living room. He goes to the kitchen and opens the refrigerator. He finds a carton of melon-flavored ice cream. He grabs a spoon and eats it, standing just feet away from the lifeless bodies. He drinks barley tea. He rummages through the drawers and finds a first aid kit to bandage his own hand, which was cut during the attack. Then he walks into the study and turns on the family computer. He surfs the internet. He looks up theatre tickets. He visits the website of the Shiki Theatre Company. He stays online for hours, the screen's glow illuminating the darkness of a dead house. He uses the toilet and leaves his feces floating in the bowl, unflushed. It is a biological signature, an act of supreme dominance and disrespect. He changes his clothes. He takes off his blood-soaked sweater, his scarf, and his fanny pack, folding them neatly or leaving them in piles. He puts on clothes belonging to Mikio. He is shedding his identity and trying on the life he just extinguished. Sometime in the daylight of December 31st, he simply walks out the front door and vanishes into the crowded streets of New Year's Eve Tokyo. When Yasuko's mother, who lived next door, entered the house on the morning of the 31st to give her grandchildren their New Year's gift money, she walked into a nightmare. The police arrived to find a treasure trove of evidence. They had the killer's DNA from the blood in the bathroom. They had his fingerprints. They had his clothes, which were mass-produced but traceable. They even had sand in the hip bag that originated from the Mojave Desert in California, suggesting he was a traveler or a skater. Yet, despite this mountain of clues, the killer has never been caught. The DNA profile does not match anyone in the Japanese criminal database. Over 280,000 investigators have worked on the case. They have chased leads to Korea, to the United States, to the skateboarding community. Every year, police officers bow in front of the house, swearing to find the man who ate ice cream while a family lay dead. The house still stands today, a rotting monument to the unsolved, encased in a protective structure, waiting for justice that may never come. The Setagaya murder terrifies us because it violates the sanctuary of the home. But it also introduces a sickening element of casual consumption. The killer did not just take lives, he consumed the comforts of the victims. He blurred the line between murder and daily routine. This perversion of consumption, this desire to absorb the essence of the victim, brings us to our next destination. We leave the cold, silent house in Tokyo for the romantic, rain-swept streets of Paris. Here, in the City of Lights, a different kind of hunger was growing in the mind of a petite, intellectual young man. He did not want to just inhabit the space of his victim. He wanted to become one with her, literally. We are about to enter the apartment of Issei Sagawa, a man whose obsession with a fellow student crossed the ultimate taboo. Prepare yourself. We are stepping away from the who and the where, and diving deep into the what. What happens when love twists into a hunger for human flesh? Paris in June of 1981 is a city blooming with romance. But inside an apartment on Rue Erlanger, a dark fantasy is festering. Issei Sagawa is a 32-year-old Japanese student at the Sorbonne. He is a man of small stature, standing only 4 feet 9 inches tall, but his desires are monstrous. He is obsessed with tall, blonde, Western women. He does not just want to be with them, he wants to possess them entirely. He believes that by consuming their flesh, he can absorb their vitality, their height, and their beauty. It is a primitive, magical thinking rooted in deep inadequacy. His fixation settles on Renée Hartevelt, a 25-year-old Dutch student. She is everything he is not, tall, intellectual, and full of life. Issei befriends her, inviting her to his apartment under the guise of translating German poetry. On June 11th, she comes over for dinner. As she sits at his desk, reading poetry aloud, Issei stands behind her. He is trembling, not with nervousness, but with the anticipation of a predator. He raises a rifle and shoots her once in the neck. The poetry stops. The silence of the apartment is heavy with the smell of gunpowder and the realization of a crossing. What follows is a descent into absolute madness. Issei does not panic. He does not call the police. He acts out the fantasy he has nurtured for years. He undresses her lifeless body and begins to consume her. He starts with her hips and thighs. He describes the meat as melting in his mouth like raw tuna. For 2 days, he lives with the corpse, eating various parts, talking to her, and treating her as a macabre doll. He feels a sense of completion he has never known. He believes he is finally becoming strong. He is no longer the small, weak man. He is now Renée. Reality eventually intrudes on his delusion. The body begins to decompose. Issei knows he must dispose of what remains of the woman he claimed to love. He packs her dismembered parts into 2 suitcases. On a rainy night, he takes a taxi to the Bois de Boulogne, a large park on the western edge of Paris. He dumps the suitcases into a lake, hoping the water will keep his secret. But the cases do not sink. They float, bobbing on the surface like buoys of guilt. A passerby sees him and alerts the authorities. The police trace the taxi, and soon they are knocking on his door. When the French police raid his apartment, they find the leftovers of his feast in the refrigerator. Issei confesses immediately, stating simply that he killed her to eat her. He is declared legally insane by the French courts, unfit for trial, and institutionalized. But here is where the story twists from tragedy to outrage. His wealthy father in Japan intervenes. Due to a legal loophole and the belief that he is dying of a rare disease, Issei is deported back to Japan. In Tokyo, doctors declare him sane, but the French charges have been dropped. He walks free. Issei Sagawa does not hide in shame. He becomes a minor celebrity. He writes books about the murder, gives interviews, and even appears in pornographic films. He makes a living off the notoriety of being the Kobe cannibal. He walks the streets of Tokyo, a free man, while the family of René Hartevelt is left with nothing but horror. He is a living testament to the failure of justice, a monster who turned his crime into a career. He looks at the camera with dead eyes and smiles, a man who literally got away with murder. The horror of Sagawa is intellectual. It is the terror of a warped mind. But there are horrors that are purely physical, born not of twisted love, but of greed and sadism. We leave the intellectual salons of Paris and the media circus of Japan for the neon-drenched, humid streets of Hong Kong in 1999. Here, a debt dispute spirals into a month-long session of torture that makes Sagawa's crime look like a mercy killing. We are entering an apartment in Tsimsha-Tsui, where a Hello Kitty mermaid doll becomes a tomb for a nightmare. Hong Kong is a sensory overload. The smell of dim sum mixes with exhaust fumes. The humidity wraps around you like a wet blanket. In the district of Tsimsha-Tsui, life moves at a breakneck speed. But on the third floor of an apartment building on Granville Road, time stopped for 23-year-old Fan Man Yi. She was a nightclub hostess, a mother, and a woman who made the fatal mistake of crossing a local triad member named Chan Man Lok. The dispute was over a debt, a few $1,000s allegedly stolen. For this sin, she would pay with her humanity. Chan, along with two accomplices, Leung Xingcho and Leung Wailun, abducted Fan and brought her to their apartment. This was not a quick execution. This was a month-long festival of cruelty. They trapped her in a small room, turning a domestic space into a slaughterhouse. For weeks, the neighbors heard sounds, but in the dense, noisy urban jungle of Hong Kong, people learned to mind their own business. They ignored the screams, attributing them to domestic arguments or the television. Inside, Fan was living through a hell that defies description. The three men treated her as a plaything for their sadism. They beat her daily with iron pipes. They poured boiling water over her skin and rubbed chili oil into her wounds. They melted plastic straws and dripped the scalding liquid onto her body. It was torture for the sake of entertainment, a slow dismantling of a human soul. Watching all of this was a 13-year-old runaway girl, the girlfriend of one of the men. She watched as Fan slowly faded, her spirit breaking long before her body finally gave out. Sometime in mid-April, Fan Man Yi died. The silence that followed was likely more terrifying than the screams. The men, realizing they had a corpse to dispose of, decided to erase her existence completely. They dismembered her body in the bathtub, a process that took hours of gruesome labor. They boiled the flesh to separate it from the bone, flushing the remains down the toilet or discarding them in the trash with the household waste. But they kept one part of her. In a final act of grotesque mockery, they took her skull and stuffed it inside the head of a giant plush Hello Kitty mermaid doll. They sewed the doll back up and placed it in the living room. For weeks, the men lived with the doll, eating and sleeping next to the remains of the woman they had tortured. The apartment was filled with the stench of death, which they tried to mask with air fresheners and strong cooking aromas. But the guilt, or perhaps the ghosts, began to weigh on the 13-year-old girl. She started having nightmares. She told social workers she was being haunted by a woman who had been tortured. She confessed that the ghost was inside the doll. The police were skeptical at first. The story sounded too macabre, too ridiculous to be true. But when they raided the apartment on Granville Road, the smell hit them first, a sickening sweetness of decay that no air freshener could hide. Then they found the doll. When they cut open the smiling face of the Hello Kitty, they found the skull of Fan Man Yi. The contrast between the symbol of innocent cuteness and the brutal reality of the crime shocked Hong Kong to its core. The 3 men were arrested and sentenced to life in prison for manslaughter, as the jury could not determine exactly which injury caused her death. The judge described the case as one of the most vicious he had ever seen in his career. The apartment building was eventually demolished, unable to shake the stigma of what happened on the 3rd floor. But the Hello Kitty murder remains a cautionary tale about the darkness that can hide behind a smiling facade. It showed us that evil does not always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like 3 bored men in a cramped apartment, hiding their sins inside a child's toy. We have witnessed the horror of a quick death, the horror of cannibalism, and the horror of torture for debt. But there is one level of hell we have not yet visited, a level where the cruelty is not motivated by money or love or even hunger. It is motivated by nothing but the pure, unadulterated desire to destroy something beautiful. We are now traveling to the industrial outskirts of Tokyo, to the late 80s. Prepare yourself. What you are about to hear is widely considered the most brutal crime in Japanese history. This is the story of 44 days that should never have happened. The year is 1988. Japan is at the height of its economic bubble. Money is flowing, the skyline is rising, and the country feels invincible. But in the shadow of this prosperity, a rot is spreading among the youth. In the quiet prefecture of Saitama, just north of Tokyo, 17-year-old Junko Furuta is living a life of promise. She is a high school senior, beautiful, intelligent, and kind. She has a part-time job, good grades, and a bright future. She is the archetype of the innocent girl next door. But innocence is a commodity to the wolves who prowl the streets after dark. On the evening of November 25th, Junko leaves her job to head home. The sun has set, and the streetlights cast long, flickering shadows on the pavement. She is riding her bicycle, humming a tune, thinking perhaps about homework or a boy she likes. She does not know that she is being watched. She does not know that a group of 4 teenage boys, led by a violent delinquent named Hiroshi Miyano, has decided that tonight they will take something that does not belong to them. They are not looking for money. They are looking for a toy. As she pedals through a quiet residential area, one of the boys kicks her bicycle. She falls to the ground, scraping her knees, disoriented. It is an orchestrated ambush. Another boy steps forward, feigning concern, offering to help her home. It is a classic predator tactic. Create the danger, then offer the safety. But the safety is a lie. Instead of taking her home, they lead her to a warehouse, assault her, and then force her to travel to a 2-story house in the Adachi district of Tokyo. This house belongs to the parents of one of the boys, Nobuharu Minato. When Junko steps across the threshold of that house, she steps out of the civilized world and into a dimension of pure sadism. She is held captive in a small room on the 2nd floor. One might expect a kidnapping victim to be hidden in a basement or a remote cabin. But Junko is kept in a bustling neighborhood, in a house where the boy's parents live downstairs. They know she is there. They see the bruises. They hear the noises. But they do nothing. They are paralyzed by fear of their own son and his gang, or perhaps simply indifferent. Their silence is the lock on Junko's prison cell. For the next 44 days, Junko Furuta endures a hell that makes the medieval torture chambers look merciful. The four boys, along with dozens of their friends who drop by to watch or participate, turn her body into a canvas for their depravity. They force her to call her parents and tell them she has run away, forcing her to smile through the receiver while they hold knives to her ribs. It is a psychological twisting of the knife, giving her family false hope while extinguishing her own. The physical abuse is relentless. They beat her until her face is unrecognizable. They burn her skin with cigarette lighters, treating her flesh like wax. They hang her from the ceiling and use her as a punching bag for hours. They starve her, forcing her to eat cockroaches or drink her own urine to survive. Every time she passes out, they wake her up to continue the game. She is not a human to them. She is an object that refuses to break. But Junko is strong. She tries to escape. She tries to plead with the parents when they briefly appear. But every attempt is met with punishment more severe than the last. As the days turn into weeks, the calendar flips to December. The world outside is preparing for Christmas. Families are buying gifts. Lights are twinkling on the trees in Tokyo. Inside the house in Adachi, the air smells of burning flesh and rot. Junko's body is failing. Her internal organs are damaged. Her wounds are infected. She can no longer walk. She can barely speak. Yet the boys show no mercy. In fact, her weakness seems to enrage them further. They are frustrated that their toy is breaking, so they escalate the violence to levels that defy sanity. They insert fireworks into her body and ignite them. They drop heavy barbells on her stomach. They laugh as she writhes in agony, high on glue and the power of absolute control. It is a frenzy of violence fueled by a mob mentality. No one says stop. No one says this is wrong. They goad each other on, competing to see who can be the most creative in their cruelty. It is the banality of evil stripped of all pretense. These are not masterminds. They are bored, angry teenagers with no moral compass, destroying a life simply because they can. On January 4th, 1989, the 44th day of her captivity, Junko plays a game of mahjong with her captors. She wins. It is a tiny, surreal victory in a sea of defeat. But the boys are sore losers. Enraged by her win and her refusal to die, they beat her with iron barbells for the final time. They pour lighter fluid on her legs and set them on fire. After hours of this final torture, Junko Furuta takes her last breath. She dies alone, surrounded by monsters, her body a ruin of what was once a vibrant young woman. But the horror does not end with her death. The boys, realizing they have killed her, do not panic. They wrap her body in blankets and stuff it into a 55-gallon oil drum. They fill the drum with wet concrete, sealing her inside a stone tomb. They load the heavy drum into a truck and drive to a reclaimed land area in Koto, Tokyo. They dump the drum into a grassy lot, believing that the concrete will hide their sins forever. They go back to their lives, to their schools, to their video games, as if nothing happened. It takes months for the truth to surface. Police, investigating a separate rape case involving one of the boys, stumble upon the story of the girl in the drum. When they finally crack open the concrete casing, the smell is the first witness. The autopsy reveals a catalogue of injuries so extensive that the seasoned medical examiners are left in tears. The press names it the concrete-encased high school girl murder case. The nation of Japan freezes in collective shock. How could this happen? How could high school boys be capable of such evil? And how could the parents downstairs let it happen? The sentences handed down are shockingly light due to the offenders' ages. They serve their time and are eventually released back into society. They change their names. They get married. They have children. But the ghost of Junko Furuta remains. She is the silent scream in the throat of Japanese society, a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural spirits, but the children we raise. Her 44 days of hell stand as a testament to the absolute depths of human depravity. The concrete drum is a heavy image to carry. It weighs on the soul. But as we leave the urban nightmare of Tokyo, we must realize that evil is not always confined to the city. Sometimes it stalks the open highways. Sometimes it wears a badge. We are heading back to the United States, to the humid swamps of Louisiana, where the police are supposed to protect the innocent. But in the 1990s, a darkness took root in the New Orleans Police Department that blurred the line between cop and criminal. We are about to meet Antoinette Frank, a police officer who swore to serve and protect, but instead walked into a Vietnamese restaurant and executed a family in cold blood. From the calculated torture of the concrete boys, we move to the explosive, impulsive violence of a rogue cop. This is not a whodunit. We know who did it. The question is, how did the system let a wolf wear the sheepdog's uniform? New Orleans in the mid-90s is not the city of jazz and jubilance that tourists see on postcards. It is the murder capital of the United States. The police department is rotting from the inside out, plagued by corruption, brutality, and incompetence. Desperate to fill the ranks, the department lowers its standards, allowing wolves to slip in through the back door. One of those wolves is Officer Antoinette Frank. She is 23 years old, with a history of lying on psychological evaluations, yet she is handed a badge and a gun. She swears an oath to protect, but her soul is already sold to greed. Antoinette moonlights as a security guard at the Kim An, a Vietnamese restaurant in New Orleans East. The owners, the Vu family, treat her like one of their own. They feed her. They give her money. The father calls her his daughter. It is a relationship built on trust and generosity. But for Frank, the Vu family is not a collection of human beings. They are a piggy bank waiting to be smashed. On the night of March 4th, 1995, the line between law enforcement and criminal enterprise dissolves completely. It is just after midnight. The restaurant is closing. Officer Frank enters the building, but this time she is not in uniform to guard them. She is accompanied by Rogers Lacaze, a drug dealer, and her lover. They are there for the cash in the safe, but there is a complication. Frank's own partner, Officer Ronald Williams, is working the security detail that night. He is a good cop, a father of two, earning extra money to support his family. He smiles when he sees Frank, thinking she is a friend. That smile is the last mistake he will ever make. Frank walks behind the counter where Officer Williams is sitting. Without a flicker of hesitation, she draws her 9mm service weapon and shoots him in the neck. As he falls, paralyzed and bleeding, she executes him with shots to the head. She has just killed a brother in blue. The betrayal is absolute. With the only threat neutralized, she turns her weapon on the family that fed her. She herds the siblings, 24-year-old Kwong Vu and 17-year-old Ha Vu, into the kitchen. They look at her with confusion and terror, unable to comprehend that the woman they trusted is their executioner. She commands them to get on their knees. They plead for their lives. Ha Vu begs, calling out her name, reminding her of their friendship. Frank responds with bullets. She shoots them both execution style, cold and precise. She rifles through their pockets, searching for the safe key, stepping over the bodies of the people she shared meals with. It is a slaughter driven by a hunger for money so petty that it makes the violence even more grotesque. But she makes a critical error. She does not check the entire building. Two of the Vu children, Chow and Kwok, are hiding. They have witnessed the carnage from the shadows of a walk-in cooler and a darkened storage room. They hold their breath, listening to the gunshots and the footsteps of the killer cop. They hear Frank leave, the bell on the door chiming cheerfully as she exits the slaughterhouse. The silence that follows is heavy, with the smell of gunpowder and blood. The survivors wait, terrified that she might return to finish the job. And in a twist of audacity that defies belief, she does. Minutes later, the police radios crackle with reports of a robbery. Frank, playing the role of the concerned officer, returns to the scene in a patrol car. She walks past the yellow tape, past the bodies, feigning shock and grief. She tries to interview the survivors, hoping to guide the narrative, to steer suspicion away from herself. But the Vu children are still alive. When they see her, they do not see a savior. They see the monster. Shaking, traumatized, Chow points a trembling finger at the woman in the uniform. "She did it," she whispers. "It was her." The interrogation room is a battle of wills. Frank denies everything, weaving a web of lies that contradicts the physical evidence. She claims she was outside, that she was a victim, but the ballistics match her gun. The survivor's testimony is damning. She is arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. During the trial, she shows no remorse, no emotion. She sits like a stone statue, a void where a conscience should be. The jury is not swayed by her badge. They see her for what she is, a predator who used the law as camouflage. Antoinette Frank becomes the only woman on death row in Louisiana. She sits there today, a ghost in a cage, claiming innocence, while the families of Ronald Williams and the Vus live with the hole she tore in their lives. The Kim An massacre shattered the community's trust in the police. It proved that sometimes the person you call for help is the very person who will pull the trigger. It is a betrayal of the social contract so profound that it leaves a permanent scar on the city's history. The horror of the Kim An restaurant lies in the intimacy of the violence. It was personal. But as we leave the humid, blood-stained floors of New Orleans, we travel northwest to the high desert of Ogden, Utah. We are moving from a quick execution to a slow, agonizing torture session in a stereo shop. In 1974, a robbery turned into one of the most gruesome crimes in American history. Prepare yourself for the Hi-Fi murders, where a group of men forced their victims to drink a corrosive liquid that would burn them from the inside out. Ogden, Utah, is nestled against the Wasatch Mountains, a quiet military town where the skyline is dominated by jagged peaks and church steeples. In 1974, it was a place where people left their doors unlocked, trusting in the insular safety of their community. The Hi-Fi shop on Washington Boulevard was a haven for audiophiles, a place to buy speakers and dream of perfect sound. But on the evening of April 22nd, the music stopped, and the silence was filled with a terror so absolute it stains the city's history to this day. Just before closing time, two men entered the shop, Pierre Dale Selby and William Andrews. They were airmen from the nearby Hill Air Force Base, men trained in discipline but consumed by a chaotic greed. They herded the 5 people inside into the basement. The group included 20-year-old Stanley Walker, the shop owner's son, Michelle Ansley, an 18-year-old cashier, Courtney Naisbitt, a teenage employee, and 2 customers, Orrin Walker and his mother, Carol Naisbitt. 5 innocent souls forced down the stairs into a cramped, windowless storage room. The robbery began like a script from a bad movie. The men demanded cash and equipment. The hostages complied, terrified but hopeful that cooperation would buy their lives. But then, a realization hit Orrin Walker like a cold fist to the gut. The robbers were not wearing masks. They had shown their faces. They had spoken in their natural voices. In the criminal calculus of Selby and Andrews, this meant one thing. There could be no witnesses. The basement was no longer a holding cell. It was an execution chamber. Selby, the ringleader of this nightmare, was not content with a simple execution. He wanted to inflict pain. He went upstairs and returned with a bottle of liquid drain cleaner. He forced the hostages to kneel. Then, with a sadistic calmness, he poured the corrosive blue liquid into a plastic cup. One by one, he ordered them to drink. "It's just vodka," he lied, though the chemical fumes burned their nostrils. Orrin Walker refused. He fought, spitting the liquid out, burning his chin and chest. But the others, terrified and coerced by the gun pressed to their heads, swallowed the poison. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The chemicals stripped the lining of their throats and stomachs. Their mouths blistered. Their airways began to swell shut. The basement filled with the sounds of retching and gasping. It was a torture designed to silence them from the inside out. But the drain cleaner did not kill them fast enough for Selby. Frustrated by their survival and their groans of agony, he escalated the violence. He bound their hands behind their backs and forced them to lie on the floor. He took his pistol and began walking down the line of bodies, shooting them in the back of the head. He shot Carol Naisbitt. He shot her son, Courtney. He shot Stanley Walker. He took Michelle Ansley into the next room and assaulted her before ending her life. Orrin Walker, the father who had fought back, lay still. The bullet meant for him had grazed his head, but he played dead. He lay in the blood of his friends and family, holding his breath, listening to the footsteps of the killers pacing around the bodies. But the horror had one final grotesque act. Selby noticed that young Courtney Naisbitt was still twitching, his body fighting the shock of the bullet and the poison. Selby did not reload his gun. Instead, he grabbed a ballpoint pen from the floor. In a fit of primal savagery, he kicked the pen into the teenager's ear, stomping on it until it pierced the brain. It was an act of gratuitous violence that defies all logic, a moment where humanity completely exited the room. Finally, believing everyone was dead, the killers left. They walked out into the cool spring air with stereo equipment and a handful of cash, leaving behind a scene that veteran police officers would later describe as a slaughterhouse. But they made a mistake. Orrin Walker was alive. Despite the burns, the strangulation attempt, and the gunshot wound, he crawled to a phone. He dialed the police, his voice a raspy whisper through his burned throat. "I've been shot," he gasped. "They're all dead." The survival of Orrin Walker, and, miraculously, Courtney Naisbitt, who survived the bullet and the pen but suffered severe brain damage, ensured that justice was swift. The testimony of Orrin Walker was the nail in the coffin for Selby and Andrews. They were hunted down, arrested, and eventually executed for their crimes. The Hi-Fi murders changed Utah forever. It shattered the illusion of small-town safety and introduced the world to a level of cruelty that seemed almost alien. The audio shop was meant to be a place of listening, of appreciating the fidelity of sound. Instead, it became a place where screams were unheard by the outside world. But sound is a funny thing. It can be captured. It can be recorded. And as we leave the silent basement in Ogden, we move to a vehicle roaming the highways of California, where the screams were not just heard, they were taped. We are entering the van of the Toolbox killers, Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, men who did not just kill for silence, but killed for the playback. If the Hi-Fi murders were about the destruction of witnesses, this next case is about the preservation of agony. Prepare yourself. We are about to listen to the tapes that made even the hardest FBI agents weep. The sun-drenched highways of Southern California in 1979 were a symbol of freedom. The era of the hitchhiker was fading, but the thumb was still a valid currency for travel. Young women stood on the shoulders of the road, smiling at passing cars, looking for a ride to the beach or the mall. They saw the silver Ford Econoline van approaching. It looked like 1,000 other work vans, a vessel of utility. They did not know that they were looking at a mobile torture chamber, a vehicle christened Murder Mac by its owners. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris were not friends in the traditional sense. They were partners in a dark enterprise. They met in prison, that great university of crime, where they discovered a shared appetite for suffering. Bittaker was the brain, a man with a high IQ and a void where his empathy should be. Norris was the muscle, the follower who craved the validation of a stronger will. Together, they formulated a plan not just to kill, but to document the complete destruction of a human being. They wanted a souvenir that would last longer than a memory. The interior of the van was modified with chilling precision. It was soundproofed to absorb the screams that would otherwise drift out onto the freeway. It was equipped with a sliding door that could be locked from the inside, trapping the victim in a windowless steel box. And most importantly, it was stocked with a toolbox. This was not for engine repair. It contained pliers, ice picks, sledgehammers, and screwdrivers. These were the instruments of their hobby. They prowled the coast, hunting for the young and the trusting. Over a period of 5 months, they abducted 5 teenage girls: Lucinda Schaefer, Andrea Hall, Jacqueline Gilliam, Leah Lamp, and Shirley Ledford. The method was deceptively simple. They would pull over, offer a ride, and once the door slid shut, the mask would drop. The girls were told that if they complied, they would not be hurt. It was the same lie predators have told for centuries. But compliance was not a ticket to safety. It was merely the opening act of a play directed by Bittaker. The horror of the Toolbox killers lies in their desire to record. They brought audio tape recorders into the van. They did not just want to inflict pain. They wanted to capture the exact moment the human spirit breaks. They forced their victims to read scripts, to beg for mercy in specific ways, directing their agony like a movie scene. The tapes are not just evidence, they are a window into the abyss. They capture the transition from hope to bargaining, and finally, to the primal realization of death. The most infamous of these recordings is the tape of Shirley Ledford. She was the final victim, picked up on Halloween night. For hours, Bittaker and Norris tortured her with pliers and hammers. The tape runs for 17 minutes. It is a cacophony of screams, pleas, and the guttural, mocking laughter of Lawrence Bittaker. He tells her to scream louder. He critiques her performance. It is the sound of a man enjoying his work. The audio is so traumatic that it is used to desensitize FBI agents at the academy in Quantico. When the pair was finally caught, thanks to Norris confessing to a friend, the full weight of their crimes hit the courtroom. During the trial, the prosecutor made a decision that would seal Bittaker's fate. He played the Ledford tape. The reaction was visceral. Jurors wept openly. People in the gallery ran out of the room to vomit in the hallway. The air was sucked out of the chamber, replaced by the recorded sounds of a girl dying in a van. And as the screams echoed off the mahogany walls, Lawrence Bittaker sat at the defense table and smiled. He did not look down. He did not cover his ears. He looked at the jury, watching their faces contort in horror, feeding off their revulsion, just as he had fed off Shirley's pain. He was sentenced to death, a verdict the courtroom greeted with applause. As he was led away, he showed no remorse. On death row, he would sign autographs for fans, reveling in his status as a monster. He died in prison of natural causes in 2019, cheating the executioner, but leaving a legacy of absolute evil. The Toolbox killers showed us the horror of the contained space. The van was a private hell moving through a public world. But what happens when the monster does not need a van? What happens when the monster invades the one place you are supposed to be safe? We are moving from the highway to the bedroom. We are traveling north to Sacramento and the Bay Area to meet a phantom who terrorized California for a decade. He did not just kill. He played games with the psyche of an entire state. He was known by many names: the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker. But history knows him now as the Golden State Killer. He was a shadow who slipped through windows, a voice that whispered threats in the dark, and a man who would eat your Christmas dinner while you lay bound in the next room. This is the story of Joseph James D'Angelo, the man who turned the suburban home into a hunting ground. California nights are supposed to be about cool breezes and the smell of jasmine, but in Sacramento in 1976, the night became a domain of absolute terror. The suburbs were besieged by a phantom who did not just break in, he invaded. He was a master of the domestic siege. He would stalk a neighborhood for weeks, learning the rhythms of the residents. He knew when you walked the dog. He knew when you turned off the lights. He knew which window latch was broken, because he was the one who unlocked it days earlier, preparing for his return. He struck when people were most vulnerable, in their sleep. Victims would wake to the blinding glare of a flashlight beam in their eyes and the metallic click of a gun. The voice behind the light was a guttural whisper, spoken through clenched teeth to disguise his natural tone. He wore a ski mask, transforming him into a faceless void. But his most terrifying tool was not the gun, it was his psychological manipulation. He controlled the room with a terrifying, calm authority that suggested he had done this 1,000 times. His signature method of control was a masterpiece of cruelty. He would bind the husband or the male partner first, tying his hands behind his back. Then, he would stack ceramic dishes or teacups on the man's back. "If I hear them rattle," he would whisper, "I will kill everyone in this house." He turned the husband into a human alarm system, forcing him to lie perfectly still while his wife was assaulted in the next room. The psychological weight of those dishes was heavier than the ceramic itself. It was the weight of total helplessness. While the victims lay bound and terrified, the intruder made himself at home. This was the most chilling aspect of the Golden State Killer. He would go to the kitchen and eat the family's food. He would drink their beer. He would watch their television with the volume turned down low. He existed in their space, absorbing their comfort while they lay in agony. It was a violation of the sanctuary so profound that many victims sold their homes immediately after, unable to live in a place that had been so thoroughly polluted. For years he was a rapist, a terror who left scars on the soul. But then he escalated. The violence could not be contained by sexual assault alone. He began to kill. In Goleta, in Ventura, in Dana Point. He bludgeoned couples to death with fireplace logs or pipe wrenches. He tied them up with complex diamond knots, a skill that hinted at military or naval training. He was a machine of destruction, moving south through California, changing his modus operandi just enough to keep the police guessing. Then he stopped. In 1986, after murdering a young girl named Janelle Cruz, the Golden State Killer vanished. The phone calls, the heavy breathing on the other end of the line, ceased. He simply melted back into the fabric of society. For decades, he was the ultimate boogeyman, a ghost story told to keep doors locked. Police had DNA evidence, but no name to match it to. He was a needle in a haystack of millions. But technology caught up with the ghost. In 2018, investigators used a revolutionary technique called genetic genealogy. They uploaded the killer's DNA profile to a public ancestry database. They did not find him directly, but they found his distant cousins. Painstakingly building a family tree, they narrowed the search down to one branch, and finally, to one man. Police surveilled an old man living in a quiet suburb of Citrus Heights. They watched him discard a tissue. That tissue sealed his fate. His name was Joseph James D'Angelo, and the revelation of his identity was the final twist of the knife. He was a former police officer. During the height of his spree, while he was terrorizing Sacramento, he was wearing a badge during the day. He had used his training, his knowledge of police tactics, and his ability to monitor radio frequencies to stay one step ahead of the hunt. The monster was not hiding in the shadows. He was standing in the roll call line. When they interrogated him, the feeble old man act dropped for a split second. He muttered about a voice in his head, a distinct personality he called Jerry, that drove him to do these things. He claimed he had pushed Jerry out, which was why the killing stopped. It was a glimpse into a fractured, evil psyche. He pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty, admitting to 13 murders and dozens of rapes. He sits in prison now, a hollow shell of the man who once made an entire state afraid of the dark. The Golden State Killer was a monster of the suburbs, a man who brought the heat of violence into the safety of the home. But there are places where the environment itself is the killer, places where the cold is not just a temperature, but a living, breathing malice. We are leaving the warm, sun-baked driveways of California. We are putting on our parkas and stepping into the Ural Mountains of Russia. It is 1959. 9 experienced hikers ski out into the wilderness, laughing, documenting their journey in diaries and black and white photos. They pitch their tent on a slope known as Dead Mountain. That night, something happens, something that causes them to cut their way out of their tent from the inside and run barefoot into the snow. They die in the freezing darkness, their bodies telling a story of impossible injuries and radiation. Prepare for the mystery of the Dyatlov Pass. The Ural Mountains are not merely a geographical feature, they are a barrier. They separate Europe from Asia, the known from the wild. In the winter of 1959, this landscape is a white void, a place where the wind howls like a dying animal and the temperature plunges to levels that can freeze the fluid in your eyes. Into this hostile beauty marched a group of 9 experienced hikers. They were young, fit, and students of the Ural Polytechnic Institute. Led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, they sought to achieve a Grade 3 certification, the highest difficulty rating for a ski tour. They were not amateurs. They knew the risks. They knew how to survive. Their diaries, recovered later, speak of laughter, of singing songs by the stove, of the camaraderie that only exists when humans pit themselves against the elements. But on the night of February 1st, something broke that spirit. They pitched their tent on the slope of Kholat Syakhl. The local Mansi people call it Dead Mountain. It was an exposed position, a strange choice for veteran trekkers, but perhaps they wanted to practice for the worst. The worst is exactly what they found. When the group failed to send a telegraph by the agreed date of February 12th, alarm bells began to ring. But it wasn't until weeks later that rescue teams found the campsite. The sight that greeted them was frozen in a grotesque tableau of panic. The tent was collapsed, half buried in snow. But the slash marks on the canvas told the story. The tent had not been torn by the wind or a bear. It had been cut from the inside. In a moment of absolute terror, the hikers had sliced their way out, choosing the freezing darkness over whatever was inside that tent. Footprints, preserved by the strange physics of the snow, led away from the camp. They were the prints of bare feet, of socks, of a single shoe. 9 people had run nearly a mile down the slope into the tree line, into temperatures of -22 degrees Fahrenheit. They left behind their parkas, their boots, and their axes. Why? What force is terrifying enough to make a human being run semi-naked into a freezer? The answer lay waiting for the searchers under a large cedar tree at the forest edge. The first 2 bodies, Yuri and Yuri, were found by the cedar. They were stripped to their underwear, lying next to the remains of a small fire. The branches of the cedar tree were broken up to 15 feet high, suggesting they had climbed it frantically, scanning the slope for the monster or the avalanche they thought was coming. They died of hypothermia, their bodies frozen into hard statues of misery. But it was the next discovery that turned a tragedy into a nightmare. Dyatlov and 2 others were found scattered between the tree and the tent. They were positioned as if they were trying to crawl back to the camp. They had died of the cold, their fists clenched, their faces masked in frost. But weeks later, as the spring thaw began, the searchers found the last 4 hikers deep in a ravine, buried under 13 feet of snow. And these bodies told a different story. A story of violence that physics could barely explain. 3 of them had fatal injuries. Thibaut Brignol had a major skull fracture. Zolotaryov and Dubinina had crushed chests. The medical examiner compared the force required to cause such damage to a car crash at high speed. Yet strangely, there were no external wounds, no bruises, no cuts. It was as if they had been squeezed to death by a giant hand. And then came the detail that haunts the sleep of everyone who reads the file. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue. She was missing her eyes. The theories exploded. Was it a Yeti? The local Mansi hunters? A secret Soviet military test? Some investigators reported that the victim's skin had turned a strange orange-brown color and that their clothes contained high levels of radiation. Others spoke of glowing orange spheres seen in the sky that night by other hikers 50 miles away. The official Soviet investigation closed the case abruptly, stating the cause of death was a compelling natural force. A phrase that says absolutely nothing and everything at the same time. Modern science suggests a slab avalanche, a rare phenomenon where a block of ice slides silently, crushing the tent and forcing the panic. The wind, known as a Karaman vortex street, could have created infrasound, a frequency that induces irrational terror in the human brain. But no theory explains the missing tongue, the radiation, or the sheer strangeness of the undressing. The Dyatlov Pass remains a locked room mystery where the room is a mountain range. It is a reminder that nature does not need a motive to destroy us. The silence of the snow in the Urals is heavy, a blanket that smothers the screams of the dying. But there is a place where screams are not smothered by snow, but by the thick, humid air of a basement in Indiana. We are leaving the mystery of the unknown force for the horror of the known evil. We are traveling to 1965, to a suburban house on New York Street in Indianapolis. Here, there are no avalanches, no aliens, no secret weapons. There is only a woman named Gertrude Banishevsky and a 16-year-old girl named Sylvia Likens. What happened in that house is often cited as the worst crime in the history of the state. It is a story of how a neighborhood watched, how children participated, and how a human being was slowly erased in plain sight. From the freezing cold, we step into the burning heat of domestic hell. Indiana is known as the crossroads of America, a landscape of flat cornfields and wholesome values. But on a tree-lined street in Indianapolis, in the autumn of 1965, the leaves were hiding a house that had become a portal to hell. The address is 3850 East New York Street. It is a humble white frame house with a porch that looks like any other. But inside, the air was thick with the smoke of cheap cigarettes and the stench of decaying morality. This is where Gertrude Banishevsky held court. Gertrude was a woman worn down by life. She was 37 years old, a frail, asthmatic skeleton of a woman with a brood of 7 children and a history of failed marriages. She was poor, bitter, and drowning in her own misery. Into this volatile ecosystem came the Likens family. Lester and Betty Likens, carnival workers who traveled for a living, needed a place for their 2 teenage daughters to stay while they were on the road. They agreed to pay Gertrude $20 a week to care for 16-year-old Sylvia and 15-year-old Jenny. It was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, a simple exchange of money for room and board. But when the first payment arrived a day late, the veneer of hospitality cracked. Gertrude did not just get angry. She unleashed a lifetime of repressed rage. She took it out on Sylvia. Why Sylvia? Perhaps because she was pretty. Perhaps because she was innocent. Or perhaps simply because she was there. Sylvia became the vessel for every frustration Gertrude had ever felt. The abuse began with beatings, a paddle, a belt, a hand, but it escalated with a terrifying speed. Gertrude, a master manipulator, convinced her own children that Sylvia was the enemy. She told them Sylvia was spreading rumors, that she was dirty, that she was stealing food. She weaponized her own offspring. The Banishevsky children, Paula, Stephanie, and John, began to participate in the torture. It became a household activity, a sick ritual performed before dinner. But the circle of violence did not stop at the family. It expanded. The neighborhood kids, boys like Coy Hubbard and Ricky Hobbs, were invited in. They were encouraged to hurt Sylvia. They burned her with cigarettes. They kicked her down the stairs. They watched as she was forced to eat her own waste. It was a Lord of the Flies scenario, played out in a suburban living room. The mob mentality took over. In that house, hurting Sylvia was not a crime. It was a way to gain favor with the matriarch, Gertrude. Eventually, Sylvia was banished to the basement. It was a cold, concrete dungeon with no light and no heat. She was tied to a beam, starved, and left to rot. The sounds of the family living their lives upstairs, the television, the laughter, the clinking of silverware, drifted down to her. She was alone in the dark, her body a map of injuries. She was dehydrated, malnourished, and in constant agony. Yet she never fought back. She tried to protect her younger sister, Jenny, who was forced to watch the horror unfold, paralyzed by the threat that she would be next. The pinnacle of this depravity occurred when Gertrude heated a needle over the stove. With the help of the neighborhood boys, she etched a message into the skin of Sylvia's stomach. They carved the words, "I am a prostitute and proud of it." It was a brand of shame on a girl who was a virgin, a final attempt to destroy her soul before destroying her body. The cruelty required to steady a hand for such an act is unfathomable. It requires a total disconnection from the human species. On October 26th, Sylvia Likens finally succumbed to her injuries. Her body simply gave up. When the police arrived, alerted by a call from a payphone, they found Sylvia on a dirty mattress. Gertrude tried to spin a story. She claimed Sylvia had run away with a group of boys and returned in this condition. She handed the officers a letter, a frantic, scribbled note she had forced Sylvia to write before she died, claiming responsibility for her own pain. But the police were not fools. The evidence was written in blood on every inch of that basement. The trial that followed captivated the nation. It was described as the single most terrible crime ever committed in the state of Indiana. Gertrude Banishevsky was dubbed the Torture Mother. When asked why she did it, she had no real answer. She blamed the drug she was taking for her asthma. She blamed the kids. She blamed Sylvia. She was sentenced to life in prison, but incredibly, she was paroled in 1985. She changed her name and lived out her days in obscurity, while Sylvia remains forever 16, a martyr of senseless violence. The house on New York Street was eventually demolished. It stood for too long as a monument to the bystander effect. The neighbors heard screams. They saw Sylvia with black eyes. They saw her weak and limping in the yard. But no one called the police until it was too late. They minded their own business. And in doing so, they allowed a torture chamber to operate in the heart of their community. Sylvia's story is one of confinement, of a slow, agonizing death in a dark room. It is a story of a woman who hated beauty and sought to destroy it. But as we leave the basement in Indianapolis, we travel back in time to the golden age of Hollywood. We are going to 1947, to a city of dreams where another young, beautiful woman was destroyed. But this time, the destruction was not hidden in a cellar. It was displayed. It was a masterpiece of macabre art left on a vacant lot for the world to see. The victim was a dreamer, a starlet who found fame only in death. She is the most famous cold case in American history. Prepare yourself for the mystery of the Black Dahlia. Los Angeles in 1947 is a city painted in two colors, the blinding gold of the California sun and the deep, impenetrable black of the shadows it casts. It is the era of the fedora, the cigarette holder, and the starlet waiting to be discovered. But on the morning of January 15th, the city wakes up to a discovery that will shatter its glamorous facade forever. On a vacant lot in Leimert Park, near the intersection of 39th Street and Norton Avenue, a local housewife named Betty Bersinger is walking with her 3-year-old daughter. She sees something white in the weeds. At first glance, Betty thinks someone has dumped a mannequin. The skin is too pale, too waxy to be human. The figure is broken in two, separated at the waist. It lies in the grass with a strange, artificial stillness. But as she draws closer, the horrifying truth settles in. It is not plastic. It is flesh. Betty grabs her daughter, covering the child's eyes, and runs to a nearby house to call the police. She has just stumbled upon the remains of Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old drifter with a flower in her hair and a hole in her pocket. The condition of the body suggests a killer with the precision of a surgeon and the mind of a surrealist artist. Elizabeth has been bisected, cut completely in half between the second and third lumbar vertebrae. The cut is clean, professional, and terrifyingly precise. But what chills the detectives is the lack of blood. The body has been drained, washed, and scrubbed clean before being dumped. There is not a drop of blood on the grass. She was killed somewhere else, prepared, and then transported here to be displayed. The killer has done more than just destroy her. He has defaced her identity. Cuts have been made from the corners of her mouth to her ears, creating a permanent, grotesque grin known as a Glasgow smile. Her arms are positioned over her head, her elbows bent at right angles. Her legs are spread wide. It is a pose of vulnerability and exposure. The killer wants us to look. He is not hiding his crime. He is exhibiting it. He has turned a human being into a piece of macabre sculpture. The press descends on the case like vultures. They nickname her the Black Dahlia, a moniker derived from a popular movie of the time, and her penchant for sheer black clothing. The newspapers sensationalize her life, painting her as a promiscuous party girl, a temptress who lured her killer. In reality, Elizabeth was a tragic figure, a young woman who came to Hollywood with dreams of stardom, but found only rejection and loneliness. She was transient, relying on the kindness of strangers, sleeping in movie theater lobbies. She was the ghost of Hollywood Boulevard before she even died. The investigation becomes a circus. Over the years, dozens of people confess to the crime, seeking 15 minutes of twisted fame. But the police focus on a few key suspects. The primary theory points to a man with medical knowledge. The bisection, the hemicorporectomy, requires skill. One name rises above the rest: Dr. George Hoddle, a brilliant but disturbed physician with connections to the surrealist art scene. His own son, a police detective, would later accuse him, pointing out that the body's pose mimicked the photography of Man Ray, a friend of Hoddle's. The killer even taunts the police. A packet arrives at the Los Angeles Examiner containing Elizabeth's birth certificate, business cards, and an address book with the name Mark Hansen embossed on the cover. The items have been wiped clean with gasoline, erasing fingerprints. A letter follows, composed of letters cut from magazines, reading, "Here is Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow." It is a cat-and-mouse game played by a mastermind who knows he is smarter than the detectives chasing him. Despite the manhunt, the interviews, and the endless theories, the Black Dahlia case remains unsolved. Elizabeth Short never got her name in lights on a marquee, but she achieved an immortality far darker. She is the patron saint of the cold case, the face of the darkness that lies beneath the Tinseltown glitter. Her severed smile mocks the vanity of a city built on images. She reminds us that in Los Angeles, beauty and death are often sleeping in the same bed. The Black Dahlia was a singular act of artistry, a focused destruction of one individual. But there are killers who do not want to be artists. They want to be gods. They do not want to control a single body. They want to control a multitude of souls. We are leaving the vacant lots of Los Angeles for the dense, steaming jungles of Guyana. We are traveling to the 1970s, to a place called Jonestown. Here, a man named Jim Jones built a utopia that became a slaughterhouse. We are about to witness the largest loss of American civilian life in a non-natural disaster prior to September 11th. This is not a murder mystery. We know who did it. The horror lies in the power of his voice. How does one man convince 900 people to drink the poison? Prepare for the white night. The jungle of Guyana is a green prison. It is dense, impenetrable, and alive with the sounds of insects that never sleep. In the Northwest District, near the Venezuelan border, a clearing was carved out of this wilderness in the mid-70s. It was christened Jonestown, named after the man who promised his followers a socialist paradise on Earth, Jim Jones. To the outside world, he was a charismatic preacher who fought for racial equality and social justice. To the 900 souls living in the mud and heat, he was Father. He was God. But by November of 1978, the paradise had rotted into a concentration camp. The air was thick with paranoia. Jones, addicted to drugs and consumed by a persecution complex, told his people that the United States government, the CIA, and the forces of capitalism were coming to destroy them. He drilled them in white nights, rehearsals for revolutionary suicide. He tested their loyalty by handing out cups of liquid, telling them it was poison, and watching them drink. When they didn't die, he praised their faith, but he was only conditioning them for the final act. On November 14th, Congressman Leo Ryan flew from California to Guyana. He had heard rumors of abuse, of people being held against their will. He arrived with a delegation of journalists and concerned relatives. For a brief moment, hope flickered in the jungle. During a musical reception in the pavilion, a note was slipped to a reporter. "Help us get out of here." The facade of happiness cracked. On November 18th, Ryan tried to leave with a small group of defectors. They made it to the airstrip at Port Kaituma, but Jones would not let his sheep leave the pen. A tractor trailer pulled up to the waiting planes. Men armed with rifles and shotguns jumped out. They didn't speak. They just opened fire. Congressman Ryan was gunned down, becoming the only U.S. congressman to be assassinated in the line of duty. 3 journalists and 1 defector also died on that blood-soaked tarmac. The survivors ran into the jungle, hiding in the brush. Back in Jonestown, the news of the shooting reached Jones. He knew the end had come. The American military would be coming. The illusion was over. It was time for the final white night. Jones summoned his congregation to the main pavilion. It was a large, open-air structure with a tin roof that amplified the sound of the rain. He sat on his throne, a slurring, manic figure in sunglasses. He told them that the congressman was dead. He told them that the enemy would parachute in to torture their children and kill their elderly. "We must die with dignity," he ranted. "We must step over to the other side." The vats were brought out, metal tubs filled with grape flavor aid, laced with cyanide and Valium. The horror of Jonestown is not just the death, it is the intimacy of the murder. They started with the babies. Mothers and nurses used syringes to squirt the purple poison into the mouths of infants. The children cried, then convulsed, and then went silent. Jones walked among them, urging them to hurry, telling them it would only hurt for a minute. "Stop these hysterics," he barked over the loudspeaker. This is not the way for people who are socialists or communists to die. He turned the death of children into a political statement. We know exactly what happened, because Jones recorded it. The death tape is 44 minutes of audio that documents the disintegration of the human survival instinct. You can hear the screaming of children. You can hear the arguments of the few who tried to resist, logic crushed by the weight of the cult's collective insanity. You can hear the applause when Jones declares that they are winning. It is the sound of a mass delusion reaching its terminal velocity. As the poison did its work, families lay down together, arm in arm. They died in huddles, a carpet of colorful clothing against the brown dirt. Jones did not drink the poison. He took the coward's way out. He was found with a bullet wound to the head, likely self-inflicted or done by a nurse at his command. When the Guyanese troops arrived the next day, the silence was deafening. 909 bodies. The smell was so overpowering that the soldiers had to wear masks soaked in vinegar. Jonestown remains the ultimate lesson in the danger of blind faith. It showed us that the most dangerous weapon is not a gun, but a voice that can convince you to kill your own children. It was a massacre disguised as a miracle. The jungle reclaimed the buildings, but the scar on the American psyche remains. It taught us to fear the charismatic leader, the man who says he has all the answers. But while Jim Jones needed a jungle and a congregation to fulfill his dark desires, there are monsters who need only a basement and a single victim to create their own twisted universe. We are leaving the heat of South America for the cold, gray streets of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We are traveling to the 1980s, to a house of horrors that operated not on religious fervor, but on cold, calculating greed and sadism. We are about to meet Gary Heidnik, a man who didn't want a congregation. He wanted a harem. He dug a pit in his basement, a hole in the ground where he kept women as breeding stock. While Jones wanted to take his followers to the other side, Heidnik wanted to create a new family in the dark, feeding them dog food and subjecting them to electric shocks. Prepare yourself for the solitary madness of the Cellar of Horror. Philadelphia is known as the city of brotherly love. It is the cradle of American liberty, a place of history and brick row houses. But in the mid-80s, North Philadelphia was a landscape of urban decay. Crack cocaine was beginning to ravage the streets, and the shadows were growing longer. On North Marshall Street, there stood a house that looked like all the others, dilapidated, unassuming, blending into the grey background of poverty. But inside, number 3520 was not a home. It was a factory of madness designed by a man named Gary Heidnik. Heidnik was a contradiction wrapped in an enigma. To the neighbors, he was Bishop Heidnik, the eccentric leader of a small self-invented church called the United Church of the Ministers of God. He drove a luxury car, a Rolls-Royce, which stood out against the trash-strewn streets like a diamond in a gutter. He was a genius with an IQ of 148, a man who had made a fortune in the stock market despite his mental instability. But his intelligence was not used for creation. It was used to construct a private kingdom where he was the absolute ruler. He did not want money. He had plenty of that. He did not want fame. Gary Heidnik wanted a family, but he did not want a family born of love and consent. He wanted a breeding stock. He believed it was his destiny to father a new race of children, and to do that, he needed women. He did not court them. He hunted them. He targeted the vulnerable, women with histories of drug addiction, prostitution, or mental health issues. Women he believed society would not miss. He was wrong. Between November of 1986 and March of 1987, Heidnik abducted 6 women: Josefina Rivera, Sandra Lindsay, Lisa Thomas, Deborah Dudley, Jacqueline Askins, and Agnes Adams. He brought them to his house, but they did not stay in the guest room. He led them down into the basement. There, he had dug a pit. It was a hole in the concrete floor, 4 feet deep, covered with heavy plywood boards and weighed down with bags of dirt. It was dark, cold, and smelled of earth and fear. Life in the pit was a degradation that stripped away humanity layer by layer. The women were kept naked. They were fed dog food. They were forced to listen to religious music or Heidnik's own sermons blaring over a loudspeaker. He controlled the light, the food, and the air. He would stand above the pit, looking down like a vengeful god, deciding who would be punished and who would be rewarded. Punishment meant beatings. Reward meant being pulled up for a brief respite, only to be assaulted and thrown back down. But the physical confinement was not enough for Heidnik. He wanted to break their minds. He used electricity as a tool of compliance. He would force the women to stand in the pit, fill it with water, and then touch a live electrical wire to the chains that bound them. The shock would convulse their bodies, a torture session that left them screaming in a soundproofed hell. It was during one of these sessions that the horror reached its zenith. Sandra Lindsay, weakened by starvation and torture, died in the pit. Heidnik did not panic. He did not mourn. To him, Sandra was simply a broken piece of equipment. But he had a problem: disposal. A body is hard to hide in a row house in the middle of a city. So, he decided to reduce the evidence. He carried her body upstairs to the kitchen. What happened next is a descent into the absolute nadir of human behavior. He dismembered her. He put parts of her body into a food processor. He cooked her flesh in a large pot on the stove, mixing it with dog food. He then fed the mixture to the surviving women in the pit. He told them what they were eating only after they had finished. It was an act of psychological cannibalism, forcing them to consume their friend, binding them to him in a pact of grotesque intimacy. The women were vomiting, sobbing, breaking under the weight of the violation. Heidnik watched, unmoved. In his twisted logic, this was just efficiency. He was recycling. He was the master of his domain, and nothing went to waste. But he underestimated Josefina Rivera. She was not just a victim. She was a survivor with a will of iron. She realized that fighting him with physical strength was impossible. She had to fight him with psychology. She began to play a role. She pretended to fall in love with him. She acted as the perfect sister wife, helping him with the other captives, agreeing with his delusions. She soothed his ego, feeding his narcissism until he began to trust her. It was a dangerous game. One slip, one moment of breaking character, and she would end up in the pot on the stove. But Josefina held her nerve. She convinced Heidnik that she was on his side. On March 24th, 1987, her patience paid off. Heidnik, believing he had finally broken her, decided to take her out for a drive to recruit a new victim. He left the gun in the car while they stopped at a gas station. This was her window. She did not run immediately. She waited for the perfect moment. When they saw a police officer, she didn't just scream. She acted. She ran to the officer, showing him the marks on her wrists, pouring out the story of the house on North Marshall Street. The police were skeptical at first. The story of a pit and cooking humans sounded like a hallucination. But when they kicked down the door of the house, the smell hit them. the smell of rotting meat and unwashed bodies. They found the women in the pit, huddled together in the darkness. They found the charred remains of human bones in the oven. They found the pot on the stove. Gary Heidnik was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, as another woman, Deborah Dudley, had also died from the electrical torture. During his trial, he tried to plead insanity, claiming he was saving the women from the apocalypse. The jury didn't buy it. They saw a man who was calculated, cruel, and fully aware of his actions. Gary Heidnik was sentenced to death. In 1999, he was executed by lethal injection, the last person to be executed in the state of Pennsylvania. He died with a belly full of steak, a final meal for a man who fed his victims dog food. The house was eventually demolished, the pit filled in, but the empty lot remains a scar in the neighborhood. It is a place where the ground seems to reject the grass, a patch of earth that remembers the screams from below. Heidnik's dungeon was a place of static, contained horror. It was a slow-motion nightmare. But there are monsters who do not want to hide in a basement. They want to turn the whole world into their playroom. They want to construct elaborate machines, intricate devices designed to maximize pain, and they want to do it in the vast, open silence of the desert. We are leaving the cramped row houses of Philadelphia. We are heading west to the dust and sagebrush of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. It is a town with a strange name, but the reality hiding there was stranger than fiction. We are about to open the doors to a shimmering silver trailer that sat in the middle of nowhere. A trailer that the owner affectionately called the Toy Box. Prepare yourself. Gary Heidnik used a pot and a wire. David Parker Ray used technology. He spent $100,000 equipping his torture chamber with surgical tools, pulleys, and saws. He was a man who recorded an audio tape for his victims, a welcome message to hell that played as they woke up from their drugged slumber. The New Mexico desert is a landscape of stark, unforgiving beauty. The sky is too big, the horizon too far away. It is a place where secrets can be buried under the sagebrush and remain undisturbed for centuries. In the town with the surreal name of Truth or Consequences, life moves slowly. It is a retirement haven, a place of hot springs and dusty roads. But 3 miles north of the city limits, near Elephant Butte Lake, sat a compound that defied the peaceful reputation of the high desert. David Parker Ray was to his neighbors a handyman, a 59-year-old mechanic who could fix anything with an engine. He was charming in a rough country way, often seen at the local bar or working on cars in his yard. But Ray had a hobby that consumed his life and his finances. Parked on his property, behind a chain-link fence and guarded by aggressive dogs, was a white cargo trailer. It looked like a storage unit for tools or camping gear. In reality, it was a custom-built soundstage for Agony. Ray spent over $100,000 outfitting this trailer. He soundproofed the walls with insulation and carpet so that no scream could escape the steel shell. Inside, he installed a surgical lamp, a gynecological stirrup chair, and an array of whips, chains, and electrical devices. He installed mirrors on the ceiling so the victims could not look away from their own suffering. He called it the Toy Box. To him, the human body was just another machine to be tinkered with, taken apart, and tested to its breaking point. The horror of the Toy Box was not just the physical pain, it was the bureaucratic precision of the ritual. Ray did not just grab women and start hurting them. He had a script. When a victim woke up, groggy from the sedatives he had injected, she would be strapped to the table. She would be disoriented, terrified, and unable to move. Ray would not speak to her initially. Instead, he would put headphones over her ears and press play on a cassette recorder. The voice that filled her head was calm, articulate, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Hello," the tape began. "You are probably wondering where you are and what is going to happen to you." It was an orientation session for hell. The recording explained in minute detail that she was now a slave. It listed the rules. It described the torture she would endure if she disobeyed. It was a psychological masterstroke, establishing his absolute dominance before he even entered the room. He stripped away their hope with a pre-recorded monologue. Ray was not alone in this enterprise. He had an accomplice, his girlfriend, Cindy Hendy. She was a former victim who had turned into a perpetrator, a woman who assisted in the abductions and the torture to save her own skin. Together, they hunted the highways and bars of New Mexico. They looked for the lost, the lonely, the women who drifted through life unnoticed. For years, they operated with impunity. Police suspect that Ray may have killed as many as 60 women, though no bodies were ever found on the property. The end of the toy box era came in March of 1999. Ray and Hendy had abducted 22-year-old Cynthia Vigil. For 3 days, she was kept in the trailer, subjected to the horrors of Ray's devices and the mind-numbing repetition of the tape. But Cynthia had a fire in her that Ray had underestimated. He made a mistake. He left the keys to her chains within reach while he was distracted. It was a 1 in a million chance. Cynthia managed to unlock one of her shackles. When Ray left the room, she fought Cindy Hendy, stabbing her in the neck with an ice pick she grabbed from the counter. She burst out of the trailer, naked except for a metal collar around her neck, and ran into the desert sunlight. She ran through the cactus and the rocks, fueled by pure adrenaline. She made it to a nearby home, pounding on the door, screaming that the devil was chasing her. The owner, terrified by the sight of the bleeding, chained woman, called the police. When the FBI raided the compound, they were unprepared for what they found. The toy box was a museum of sadism. They found thousands of videotapes, journals detailing the torture, and trophies taken from the victims. But they found no bodies. Ray was smart. He allegedly claimed that he dismembered his victims and scattered them in the desert or fed them to the wild animals. The lack of remains meant that he could only be charged with kidnapping and torture, not murder, though the implication was clear. David Parker Ray was convicted and sentenced to 224 years in prison, but he cheated justice in the end. Only 1 year into his sentence, he died of a heart attack in a prison cell. He took the location of the bodies and the true number of his victims to the grave. The toy box was dismantled, but the legend of the trailer in the desert remains a cautionary tale about the monsters that hide behind the facade of the friendly local mechanic. The toy box was a place of technological terror, a sterile environment of metal and electricity. But evil is adaptable. It does not always need a machine. Sometimes it relies on ancient beliefs, on the power of blood and superstition. We are crossing the border now. We are leaving the dry heat of New Mexico for the humid, chaotic streets of Matamoros, Mexico. We are traveling to 1989 to a ranch called Santa Elena. Here, a cult leader named Adolfo Constanzo did not use technology to control his followers. He used magic. He convinced them that human sacrifice could make them invisible to the police and bulletproof in a gunfight. Prepare yourself for the nightmare of the narco-Satanists, where a cauldron found in a shed contained ingredients that shocked the world. The border between Brownsville, Texas, and Matamoros, Mexico, is more than a geographical line. It is a membrane where cultures, economies, and laws bleed into one another. In the spring of 1989, the air was filled with the sounds of partying college students on spring break. Among them was Mark Kilroy, a 21-year-old pre-med student with a bright future. He vanished on a street in Matamoros while waiting for his friends. His disappearance sparked a massive manhunt, but no one looked in the direction of the Santa Elena ranch. Santa Elena was not a drug den in the traditional sense. It was a temple. The man who ruled it was Adolfo Constanzo, known to his followers as El Padrino, or the Godfather. Constanzo was a Cuban-American fortune-teller who had twisted the beliefs of Palomayombe into a dark, unrecognizable religion. He preached a terrifying gospel to the drug cartels. I can make you invisible. I can make you bulletproof. But the price of this protection is not money. The price is blood. Constanzo had a partner in this madness, a woman named Sara Aldrete. To the outside world, she was a model student at a Texas college, a tall, charismatic woman nicknamed La Madrina. But at night, she crossed the border to stand by Constanzo's side as he butchered human beings. She was the face of the duality of evil, the honor student who washed the blood off the altar. Together, they built a cult that believed the screams of their victims fed the spirits that protected their shipments of cocaine and marijuana. The break in the case came not from detective work, but from arrogance. A drug runner named Serafin Hernandez drove through a police roadblock, believing Constanzo's magic made him invisible. The police, who could very clearly see the truck, gave chase. They followed him to the remote Santa Elena ranch. What they found there was not just a stockpile of narcotics. They found a shed that smelled of sulfur, rotting flesh, and ancient evil. Inside the shed, officers found a large iron cauldron known as a nganga. It was the heart of Constanzo's power. It was filled with a foul black stew of blood, animal carcasses, melted wax, spices, and human remains. There were human brains in the pot, believed to give the cult the intelligence of their victims. There were turtle shells for protection, a horseshoe for luck, and sticking out of the muck were wooden sticks, representing the spirits they commanded. It was a scene from a medieval nightmare brought to life in the 20th century. The search of the ranch grounds revealed the true cost of this magic. Officers began to dig. They found 12 bodies buried in shallow graves. Among them was Mark Kilroy. The details of his death were sickening. He had been chosen because Constanzo needed a brain of a student, someone smart, to feed the Nganga. Mark had been tortured, sodomized, and then killed with a machete chop to the back of the neck. His spine had been removed to be worn as a trophy necklace by the high priest. The discovery sent shockwaves through both nations. The idea that sophisticated drug traffickers were relying on human sacrifice was incomprehensible. It was a collision of modern organized crime and primal superstition. Constanzo and his inner circle fled to Mexico City, hiding in an apartment building. But the law was closing in. The magic had failed. The invisibility was a lie. On May 6th, the police surrounded the apartment. Constanzo, realizing there was no escape and unwilling to rot in a prison cell, made a final, desperate command. He ordered one of his followers, El Dubi, to shoot him. As the police stormed the room, they found El Padrino dead, riddled with bullets from his own machine gun, surrounded by piles of cash he had thrown around the room in a final act of nihilism. Sara Aldrete was captured alive, claiming she was a victim, a hostage to Constanzo's will. The courts did not believe her. She sits in a Mexican prison today, a fallen high priestess of a dead religion. The narco-Satanists showed us that evil can be a belief system. It can be rationalized. Constanzo didn't kill for pleasure like David Parker Ray. He killed for utility. He believed murder was a tool, a shield against the law. It forces us to confront the fact that in the darkest corners of the human mind, superstition can be just as deadly as a loaded gun. But we have one final door to open. We have traveled the world, from the rice paddies of Korea to the jungles of Guyana. We have seen cults, cannibals, and torturers. But all of these horrors seem to converge in one single image, the image of a clown, a man who was a pillar of his community, a precinct captain, a man who shook hands with the First Lady. We are heading to the suburbs of Chicago, to Des Plaines, Illinois. We are going to a house that sat on a quiet street, a house that smelled faintly of putrefaction that the owner blamed on a faulty sewer. We are about to enter the crawl space of John Wayne Gacy. Prepare yourself for the finale. This is the monster who taught us that the face of evil can be painted with a smile. The suburbs of Chicago in the 1970s were the architectural blueprint of the American dream. Split-level houses, manicured lawns, and neighbors who borrowed cups of sugar. Des Plaines was one such sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the city felt miles away, and the king of this castle was John Wayne Gacy. To the outside world, he was a success story. He was a contractor who built businesses. He was a precinct captain for the Democratic Party. He organized the Polish Constitution Day parade. He even had his picture taken with the First Lady of the United States, Rosalind Carter. But Gacy had another face. On weekends, he would paint a smile over his own, donning the ruffled collar and the oversized shoes of Pogo the Clown. He performed at children's hospitals and block parties, twisting balloons into poodles and making children laugh. "Clowns can get away with murder," he once told a friend. It was a joke that froze the air in the room. It was not a figure of speech. It was a confession hidden in plain sight. For beneath the floorboards of his ranch-style house at 8213 Summerdale Avenue, the devil was keeping a collection. The duality of John Wayne Gacy is what makes him the ultimate American monster. He was not a drifter like Henry Lee Lucas. He was not a hippie cult leader like Charles Manson. He was one of us. He was the man you hired to remodel your kitchen. He was the man who hosted the neighborhood summer barbecues. People loved his parties, but there was always a complaint: the smell. Guests would wrinkle their noses at a heavy, sweet stench of putrefaction that permeated the living room. Gacy would wave it off, blaming a backed-up sewer or moisture in the heating ducts. He would pour lime in the crawl space to mask it, but the smell of 33 rotting corpses is a stubborn ghost. The facade began to crack in December of 1978. 15-year-old Robert Peast disappeared after leaving his job at a Nissan pharmacy. He told his mother he was going to speak to a contractor about a summer job. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. When P.S. didn't return, his mother didn't wait. She called the police. This time the missing boy wasn't a runaway or a drifter. He was a local son, and the connection to Gacy was undeniable. Detective Joseph Kazanjak refused to let go, despite Gacy's political connections and arrogance. When the police obtained a search warrant, Gacy played the victim. He invited them in, offered them coffee, and acted the part of the harassed businessman. But the officers felt the heat. The furnace was running at full blast, a desperate attempt to dry out the moisture of death rising from below. And then, There was the bathroom. The smell was overpowering. It wasn't sewage. It was the unmistakable scent of organic decay. Detective Kozenjak knew. He knew that the house was not a home. It was a mausoleum. The investigation revealed a modus operandi that was chilling in its simplicity. Gacy preyed on young men, often hiring them for construction work. He would gain their trust, then lure them into a magic trick. He would produce a pair of handcuffs and offer to demonstrate how he could escape from them. "Put them on," he would say. "I'll show you the trick." Once the cuffs clicked shut, the trick was over. The clown vanished, and the sadist emerged. He would torture and strangle them with a rope, twisting a garrote until the light left their eyes. On December 21st, the digging began. Police officers crawled into the narrow, dark space beneath the house. It was a claustrophobic nightmare, a sea of mud and trash. But as they scraped away the topsoil, they found a bone, then a skull, then another. The crawl space was packed so tightly with bodies that they were layered on top of one another. The excavation became an archaeological dig of horror. Men in hazmat suits carried out body bags, one after another, as the neighbors watched in stunned silence. The man of the year had been sleeping on top of a mass grave. The final count was staggering. 29 bodies were recovered from the property, 26 in the crawl space, 3 buried elsewhere on the lot. 4 others had been thrown into the Des Plaines River because Gacy had simply run out of room. 33 lives extinguished. 33 futures stolen. The sheer industrial scale of the murder was difficult to comprehend. He had turned murder into a domestic chore, something to be managed alongside the laundry and the taxes. During the trial, Gacy was defiant. He claimed insanity, but the jury saw through the act. They saw the meticulous planning, the graves dug in advance, the calculated disposal of evidence. They saw the arrogance of a man who believed he was smarter than the law. He was sentenced to death. On death row, he spent his time painting. He painted portraits of the 7 dwarfs, of Jesus, and of course, of Pogo the clown. He sold them to collectors, a final act of capitalization on his own infamy. On May 10th, 1994, the state of Illinois executed John Wayne Gacy by lethal injection. His last words were reported to be, "Kiss my ass." It was the final statement of a sociopath who felt no remorse, only contempt for the society that judged him. The house on Summerdale Avenue was bulldozed, erased from the map. A new house stands there now, with a different address, but the soil remembers. The legacy of Gacy is the realization that a monster doesn't have to look like a monster. He can look like a clown. And so, we have reached the end of our journey. We have traveled 20,000 miles through the geography of human darkness. We started in the cold, silent cockpit of a missing plane, staring into the abyss of the Indian Ocean. We walked the rain-slicked streets of London with Jack the Ripper and the muddy fields of Korea with the Hwaseong killer. We have seen the horrors of the domestic sphere, from the concrete drum in Tokyo to the torture basement in Indianapolis. We have witnessed the different faces of evil. We saw the intellectual evil of Issei Sagawa, who tried to consume beauty. We saw the chaotic evil of Richard Ramirez, who struck like lightning. We saw the bureaucratic evil of the Nazis and the charismatic evil of Jim Jones. We saw the technological evil of the toy box killer and the superstitious evil of the narco-Satanists. Each case was a different mirror, reflecting a fragmented image of what happens when the human soul breaks. We have looked at the who, the how, and the why. But perhaps the most terrifying question is the one we are left with. Where? Where does this darkness come from? Is it born, or is it made? Is it a virus that infects the mind, or is it a seed that lies dormant in all of us, waiting for the right conditions to bloom? We want to believe these people are aliens, distinct from us. But Gacy was a neighbor. Bundy was a law student. Raider was a church president. They were woven into the fabric of our daily lives. This journey has been a descent, a Dantean tour of the inferno. But the purpose of staring into the dark is not to despair. It is to recognize, to see the warning signs, to listen to the screams that are often silenced by our own indifference. We tell these stories not to glorify the killers, but to remember the victims, to speak the names of Sylvia Likens, of Junko Furuta, of Elizabeth Short, of the children of Jonestown. They are the ones who matter. They are the light that the darkness tried to extinguish, but failed. The files are now closed. The tapes are rewound. The evidence is boxed away. But the story of human nature continues. The night is always out there, waiting. And as long as there are shadows, there will be those who hide in them. But remember, shadows cannot exist without light. Keep your lights on. Lock your doors. And never, ever forget to look beneath the surface. This has been the True Crime Chronicles. I am your narrator. Thank you for walking this path with me. Until next time, stay safe and watch the shadows.